All right, how's everybody doing? Today, I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk through my philosophy and my process for routing and group processing with a Yamaha TF mainly. We've gotten a lot of questions about this over the last couple weeks and just wanted to take a little bit of time to explain the way that I'm setting up schools. I've got most of my schools right now that are still using Yamaha TF5s, which is totally fine, but I think most people by now have figured out that there's a little bit of some lacking functionality on that console, and there's some creative ways to squeeze a little bit more life out of it, in my opinion. And I wanted to just take some time to explain how I'm doing that, why I'm doing that, and then some of the ways that you can make your life a little bit easier from a band director or front ensemble director's perspective using a Yamaha TF. So, to start today, we're going to have to go through some basic terminology and some things to kind of get on the same page and understand some of the discrepancies between a TF and some other consoles. So I have a TF offline editor here that I'm going to explain a lot with, and then I also have an SQ mix pad. I'm using these two choices today. The first one's pretty obvious because I'm talking about a TF, and then the second one is an SQ, and they have a lot of similarities. Actually, the SQ's a much more capable console, but the thing that it does really well that's similar to a TF is that the language and the view of the console itself, the iPad app, and the Mac or Windows editor is similar as opposed to some other consoles. If you look at an X32 editor, the desktop version versus the iPad version, you'll notice there's a lot of discrepancies. So I'm not using an X32 in today's language just because this is a lot like what an SQ looks like. Especially Mixpad is essentially the same app, no matter if you're on Windows or sorry, if you're on desktop or iPad. And then a TF is similar with a few other kind of functionality discrepancies, but for all intents and purposes, the design language is the same, and I think that's kind of important. So, to start, there's some terminology we have to all be on the same page about. I'm going to talk about buses today quite a bit, and I know for some people that term is a little bit strange and hard to wrap your head around, especially because we've got lots of words for the same thing in the audio world. So, um, the easiest way to conceptualize this to begin with is that everything in audio is a source and a destination. So you have your sources, that could be a microphone for all intents and purposes, and then you have your destinations, and that could be a speaker. But in console routing, we're removing, especially digital consoles, we're removing the need for the physicality of those objects. So there are things that we can pull sound from, and there are things that we can push sound to. And if you think of those two words as your sources and destinations, it gets a little bit easier. So a source is where's the sound coming from, and a destination is where we're sending it to after we're done with it. And every link in the chain along the way thinks of those the same. So, buses, what does that mean for buses? So, buses are generally a destination in this analogy, and the problem with it is there's several words for them. On a TF, you have four different types of fader banks. On the physical console, if you're looking at the console and it's kind of in front of you, it would be at the top right, kind of right above the faders. If I'm doing it on the computer, it would be like here-ish. And there's going to be three buttons. It'll be an input one, input two, output, and then press the first two for groups and the last two for custom. So on the app, you have desktop. It's also an app. I'm trying to find the right word. I would just call this application, right, or the editor. You have inputs, you have groups, you have outputs, and you have customs, and these translate to those layers. So, obviously, the first thing that everyone would notice after hearing the description that I just gave you is that the outputs are outputs. That probably aligns to the physical outputs on the back of the board. And then the groups would be groups, right? No. And that's one of the weird things is that buses, and I know I haven't defined group yet, so we're getting there, but Buses have lots of names, and every console manufacturer treats them a little bit differently, but they do have understood use cases, right? And normally when somebody says a group or when they say an aux, they mean different things. If someone says a bus, they might mean the same thing. And that's where this gets a little confusing. And Yamaha in particular, especially on the TF, has done a little bit of a disservice, in my opinion, in the way they treat these groups, right? So back to sources, destinations. There's 4 words you're going to end up hearing in this conversation that could mean group in a sense, right? Or could mean bus in a sense. Bus is generally kind of an umbrella term, or it will mean like a processing capability that the board has. So you might say that this board has 40 buses, right? But that might include all of the outputs. So think all destinations. That might include your main left, right, out. That might include any headphone outputs. That might include effects buses or just effects that you can use on the board. Might include a lot of things. An aux generally means an auxiliary mix, right? So that would mean in TF land, on the outputs you have here, these are labeled auxes. These are what I would consider them, right? And this is another thing that you can assign to a physical output, right? So we could send our main and then 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 more mixes this way, right? A mix might also mean the same thing, which I'll show you in SQ in a little bit. And then a group is a little bit different, and a group is generally just a place where we combine sounds together. So we're going to group them together to control and affect and process them together. Now, you might have already noticed the problem. In TF land, you click on the group tab. I'll show you this here. Sorry, I'm going to try and zoom slowly so I don't give anyone whiplash here. You'll see that these are labeled DCA. Okay, so what is a DCA, and why is that not just a group? So a DCA, it stands for digitally controlled amplifier, and that is basically a remote control. It's not a group. And the difference is a DCA is basically the only thing that doesn't fit in the sources destination conversation, which I know is very confusing. The DCA is not an audio path, and that's the easiest way to think about it. Audio doesn't go through them. They don't have processing. They don't have EQ. It's not a place for audio to go first, right? It's not a bus stop. You can think about DCAs as remote controls, whereas you can think about buses and groups and all the other things as, you know, moving cars on a highway. Audio is going through them. That's getting on a bus. It's going somewhere else. That's an analogy we've all used along the way. But a DCA is not a bus. Audio does not get on it and go anywhere else. It doesn't process. It doesn't do any of those things. It does group them, kind of. Here's what a DCA does. Digitally controlled amplifier. It is a subtractive fader, right? You can also add, you can go plus, but most of the time we're going to be pulling stuff down. And what it does is when you click on one in TF, you can see that it spills to the left over here, right? These are the channels that are assigned to this DCA. So I have a Woods DCA, all 8 marimba mics. And if I set this one to -6, we'll get exact for explanatory purposes. Right now I have these faders at 0. They're going to be at negative infinity. Sorry, not 0. That's important. They're going to be at negative infinity, -6. Okay, so nothing's going to happen. But this fader's at negative 11.5. So we're going to add -6 to that, and it's going to be at negative 17.5. Right? This fader's at negative 19.15, so that one's going to be at around negative 25 or so. And that. And you're going to see this without it actually happening, right? So in reality, what we should do is leave all these at 0, right? And now you can assume that these 4 faders, because they're assigned to the DCA, turn that on for now, they are, for all intents and purposes right now, they're sitting at a level of -6. So essentially, if I pull this all the way down, that turns off all of my marimba mics, okay? That's all it does. Doesn't process, it doesn't EQ, it doesn't anything. I'm going to pull my metals down here. Everything assigned to this metals DCA is now -12, right? All these vibe mics are around -3. They're all now going to be around -15. It's that simple. So DCA is a remote control. A group is a place that combines all of those signals and groups them together first and processes it and then sends it somewhere else. And then a bus is kind of an umbrella term for right now. Is we're just going to say, well, I'm not going to say too much bus too often. But then an aux is a place where we're going to send it out to a physical speaker, right? For now, that's what we're going to go with. So on a TF, what you're going to find, This is the general workflow. This is the custom layer that I use for my schools. You'll see on this workflow right now, I'm going to put this at 0 for example. I have a wood group and I have a metal group, and these are at -9 and -10 respectively. And I have a woods DCA and a metals DCA. The question most people ask at this point is why do I have both? Don't they do the same thing? Because the wood group is grouping together everything that's assigned, which I'll go ahead and tell you is just marimbas. It's the same as the DCA for now. If I pull this down, that pulls all the marimbas down because they're only going through the group, right? And if I pull this down, that also pulls all the marimbas down because they're only going through the group, right? Well, yes, and here's why. I use multi-level workflow to provide control to clients. So when you're in the middle of a show, you have options, and it also helps with the mixing, and there's some processing that you can do in this group tab. So before we get started with this, I'm going to explain using the SQ app a little bit about how this differs from SQ Land and a little bit about what you're going to run into on a regular console. So on SQ, you can see on this console we have buses that we can configure, right? So you get 12 buses, like I mentioned earlier, but you can assign them in any combination of 12 to be groups or auxes. So if we go to our mix tab, which again is another word that could mean that, we now see essentially what is an outputs tab on a TF, right? So we have groups up here. I'll show you so you can see. These are labeled GRP. And we have 8 groups. So we have group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which we're using. This is woods, metals, drums, timpani, field, and then we have a little stage. And then we have 7 and 8 that I'm not using. And then on the aux side, we have now aux 1, 2, and then 3, 4. And this is inside, outside. So for this specific school, there's an inside pair of speakers and there's an outside pair of speakers. And you'll notice on the right side, this is my sends on faders function. And this is kind of a thing that I for this purpose, I need to assume that most people understand. And that's that the inside and outside are auxes. And when you click on those, you have sends on fader. Send on fader is the functionality of when you click on a mix, the fader turns into a level control for a specific send, right? This is most commonly used for soloists, so I'll pull up some soloists. This group has 8 RF or wireless channels, and this effects engine is right now just an effect. It's a digital effect, and we don't have to see it. It's a reverb, right? So if I click Effects 1 Send, you can now see right now that these levels are down. If I click Effects 1 Send, they're up. This is for channel 5, RF5, and this flute mic. We'll use either one. Right now the flute's got this amount of reverb, and the trumpet or whatever this RF5 is less, right? And then if I go to effects 2, you can see that it's kind of inverted. So now I've got more on this RF5 and less on this RF6. So these are level controls. This might be a specific type of reverb or delay. This might be a specific type of reverb or delay. And then you also have the main level send with that. So sends on faders are important because they help us get a really visual representation of what we're mixing to on the board, and you can see it. A group differs in that most groups don't have send on fader functionality. So over here on SQ, the sends, they stay on the sends tab even if they're groups because it's configurable. So when I click on this group, you'll see they turn green or whatever color the channel is, right? So you can see it a little bit differently, whereas the insides, outsides are the same color for right now. And I do that color coding to make it easier for me. But you can tell immediately that it's a different functionality because it turns green, but only on this top level, not on the fader. And that just shows you that there is no fader control. If I go to layer A, you can see this is the wood group. These have on-off buttons, but they do not have faders. And you can see because if I move these faders around, they won't move when I go back to the main layer. But for the sends on the insides, they will. Okay, so every bus, basically for every console always, is going to have a send fader for everything but a group, and then it's also going to have an on button or an assign button for every bus. So if it's a group, you're not going to have that fader control because it uses the fader values from the main layer. So it's just going to blend them all together as if you're mixing it normally. And then all of your sounds are going to be combined until you get to this wood group, okay? Now, it sends to those groups in addition to sending to the main level, but it uses their faders. The difference in that and an aux is that an aux has the same thing, but it has an on button and a send fader, right? And it can also use the levels of the main fader if you like. But to do that, you have to go to the routing tab and you have to set it to be post or pre. Post and pre is another thing we have to kind of assume, but a pre-send means that it is going to send using the send on fader control, which you'll see here, right? And not the main fader. And post send means that it will use the send on fader control. I can set this to pre or post here, right? Pre lit up pre means it is set to pre. But post, which means that it's just off, will mean that it uses the amount but attenuated by this fader, right? So that means if I'm sending marimba 3 high mic to this inside speaker stack at 0, which just means unity or no change, then whatever this fader is will be the send value of that, because it's going to follow this fader, or it's going to be a post fade send. It's going to send it post or after this fader affects it. So if I turn this value down, it will be the same functionality, but it will be softer at 0, right? So essentially this is a how much do you want control of, and this is the remote control of it. That's probably really complicated for a lot of people. Totally get it. Over time, this will hopefully make a little bit of sense. So bear with me as we go. In SQ land, we have groups. For those groups, we mentioned as kind of a recap that those groups only have assign buttons. They do not have faders. In the insides or outsides, which are auxes in this example, do have faders, right? So that's a level control. Other than that, they're basically the same thing, because groups have specific functionalities that DCAs don't have. Back to that DCA conversation. And as you can see, the transition here is I'm teaching you what DCAs are doing, and then I'm teaching you what groups do in addition to them, essentially. And then buses are a little bit different, right? So on a group, you have stuff like EQs. You have a graphic and a parametric, and then you also have compressors. On a DCA, which we also have on SQ, by the way, you don't have that. You just have assignments. And this should look pretty similar because it's just this. Same idea, right? So DCAs can only be assigned. They can only control volume. Whereas a mix or a group has processing. You can also see the auxes have processing. They have the same idea, right? So groups and auxes are actually a lot closer to each other than groups and DCAs, despite the fact that groups and DCAs, in my philosophy, have similar use cases. Okay? So back to TF. So on TF, we don't have groups. That's a problem. Because the way I use this is during rehearsals, instead of have my groups change each individual level of each keyboard, I process everything and do it on the group side. So on your scenes, whenever you're saving scenes, you don't have to move like this. Right? You can already see the problem. I'm going to try and get everything about the same level, maybe. It creates a really big hassle. Okay? So I like to do it on groups because it's easier for me and anyone who's running the board. And then it also provides me an option to process. So if I put stuff in my group, then I can come in and I have compression. I also have EQ. I have lots of stuff, okay? So how do I do that? In TF language, we have auxes, but we can make our auxes into groups. The way I do that is I go in, and first you have to check the routing page on the main channel, and you'll see that there's assign buttons. Remember how I said every bus has an assignment button? You'll see assignment buttons for the ST and the sub bus on each channel. So on TF, we have a sub bus. That's a mono bus here. You'll see two things that are labeled sub, though. And this is where this gets a little confusing. This one that's just sub, you can see that this is actually an aux, which I'll explain later. This one's an aux. This one that's just labeled sub, this is the name, this is the actual bus configuration. That's one I'm currently talking about, and we're going to unassign it from both of those. The sub is probably fine. You're not going to need that unless you're using it, and you would know if you're using it. But I unassign it from everything to be correct. I'm going to unassign it from both of those. And that means that without routing this through the group or through the aux that I'm about to show you, this marimba channel will not come out of your main speakers. And 99% of bands are using two big speaker stacks, somewhere between the 30 and the 40 probably, and they're going right out of your main stereo feed here, right? So if you come in here and you unassign this from the stereo, nothing will come out of that speaker, which might be what you want. But what we're also going to do is we're going to come in and we're going to send it to our aux. So what I'm doing is I've gone to my output channel, and for the stereo auxes, it's very important to use the stereo auxes here because we are panning the channels. I'm going to send all of my woods to one of them, and all of my metals to another one, and all of my drums, this drum set, to each of those. And that's how I'm using these processing buses as buses. I'm just going to combine all the audio. And then instead of sending that audio out to an Omni out, I know this is assigned to 910 right now, but nothing's plugged into 910, so it doesn't really matter. Instead of sending that out to just an output or an XLR jack, I'm going to assign the bus to go out to the main layer. So what's happening is instead of routing these keyboards, marimbas and vibraphones straight to the output, they're going to take a little pit stop on the aux bus here first. Okay, so these are unassigned from the stereo, and these are assigned to the stereo. So now on the custom layer, I don't need to see any of the marimba channels. So your mixer student, if you're in Texas and you have to have a student do it, your mixer student doesn't have to touch those channels. They can basically live in this mode and never see anything. So for this school, this mixer student only has to see woods, metals. We have 2 hardware synths and a sampler. And then we have flute, clarinet, trombone, 3 euphoniums. I'll explain this euphonium group in a minute. And then DCAs. Okay. Great question that you're already asking. Why do I have DCAs and groups at the same time, right? So now all my audio is going through here. Once we did that, didn't we just make a master control for our marimbas here, the same we have a master control for our marimbas here? Yes. But again, the group provides better functionality because we have EQ and compression and stuff, right? So shouldn't we just not use the DCA? And that's a great answer, and the answer is also yes. Once I've grouped everything, I have EQ. So this is just a little example EQ for this keyboard. You don't need to use this necessarily. That vibe, that might actually be accurate. I'm not sure. But I went ahead and grabbed this and just made some EQ. Now my marimba group has this EQ on it. It could have this EQ on it for all we care, but it has EQ on it, and I have full group functionality. That is helpful because on the input channel, I'm already EQing for each mic position, okay? I've done a few things to each of these keyboards to make them sound good, but on the wood group, I wouldn't do that for every keyboard because they're all combined. But what I can do is change the overall tone of my marimbas in general, right? So if I thought, hey, maybe even for this scene only, I need more articulation, okay, well, I can come up here and I can cut out some of the lows, and I can maybe, if I want to, boost some of the highs. Sorry, these two bands got mixed around. I could boost some of the highs if I really wanted to. Wouldn't do that. I could cut out some of the articulation. I could boost some of the lows if I wanted to. I could do low passing or high passing or both, right, via these. So I could do something like this if I really wanted to. You can do a lot of stuff, but you have the control, and that's kind of the important part, right? So this also keeps the panning, so it does all the things right. So you have EQ. You also have compressing. If you want to compress everything in the marimbas a little bit, you also have an effect. I'll get to that in a little bit. Lots of control. But the important part here is the discrepancy in how it interacts with the scenes. So I have scenes here, and you'll see on these scenes that there's some stuff that's moving as I go through these scenes. You'll also see some stuff that's not moving. That's the important part. So if I go to my recall safes menu here, you can see on this one I have, and there's a couple right answers to this. I'll explain it. So don't just copy these settings yet. But I have all my keyboards, and they are safe on the head amp, which is the gain, the input select, which is the physical jack, and on TF it's actually a little bit different. But for all intents and purposes, is where you plug in processing, which includes your EQ, compression, etc. Send to, which is our send to here on our auxes, This is the same functionality as SQ. Our fader, which is our physical fader, our on, which is on, and then our name, which is name. Okay. You'll see that is a little bit different for stuff like the soloists and the synths. Some of these soloists are a little different, some are not. These are pretty specifically set up for this group because it depends. But it's important to note that the things that are unsafe here are on and fader for individual keyboards and for groups, which I'll show you here. So here's the groups. These are the auxes actually, but I'm using them as groups. Fader is off. Everything else is set to be safe. On the DCA, everything is safe. So what this means is every time I flip a scene, if the fader is off or not safe for individual keyboards, then it will move. Every time I flip a scene for the outputs, if the fader is unsafe, which is here, it's off, that fader for the groups will move, but the DCAs will not. Okay, so that means on a per scene basis, you can have individual keyboard control. So if you want more of the second marimba part or the third marimba part, you could boost, you can cut, you can go up and down in your volumes. You can also do individual reverb and processing levels and everything for keyboards if you want. I normally don't do that, but you can. You can do whatever you want, and that will get recalled when you hit recall. Okay? And this is actually a great example because in this section of the show, there's this marimba player that's playing some glockenspiel parts on their keyboard, and I got that turned down because the glockenspiel is like high on the instrument, so it's the high mic that it's bleeding into a little bit. So you have that option. On the groups, they're also moving on a per scene basis. So if you go to letter K here, you can see they moved a little bit. Go to segment 5, see they moved a little bit more, right? I think this is trombone soloist. Ideas, okay? But the DCA does not move. So the philosophy here is that each of these has a different functionality based on when you're using it. So the groups actually give you functional relative control. So a good example would be like the glockenspiel thing. You can do individual mics, but on the groups, it would be, for instance, for the ballad, maybe the marimbas and keyboards don't have to be as loud, right? For the end of the show moment, maybe the impact, maybe you've got a lot of cymbal and you want to just pull the mics down entirely, so it's just acoustic cymbal. You can do that. That's great. But what happens if, for instance, you get into a specific stadium and a specific section is really, really loud or boomy in that stadium? Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. Let's decide marimbas one day decide to be a bunch of heroes and everybody's playing 3 dynamics too loud. Okay, so first scene of the show, marimbas are too loud. Pull them down. Second scene of the show. Okay, marimbas are still too loud. Pull them down. Third scene of the show. Hey, marimbas are still really loud. We see the problem, right? So what you can actually do is we say, okay, beginning of the show, marimbas are really loud. Let's pull them down. Maybe a lot, maybe a little bit. Let's say 4.5. That's reasonable, medium level. Okay, so now every scene, regardless of what the groups are doing, remember how that additive DCA thing works. These DCAs are going to pull 4.3 off of each, not the group, but each individual channel. So it maintains this balance. It also maintains the balance inside of the group because it pulls the faders after that. And it maintains it across scenes because this doesn't move on a per scene basis. You can see as I click the DCA, or click the scenes, the DCA doesn't move. So this is kind of your absolute balance, and this is your relative balance. So if a group is loud, and even often the more common one is actually electronics, and that one's a little bit different because we don't have these moving on a per scene basis because I do all of my electronic edits on the device itself, but still worth having a DCA for. Electronics are really loud today. Pull them down. Done. Okay, synth 2, that person is being too loud today. Pull them down, right? There's ways to kind of bust it together and make it make sense. So essentially what you have is relative control to the show. So this would be the dynamics that you have on the page. And then you have absolute control during the show. So these would be the dynamics of the room, essentially. Same thing with the main. The main doesn't move, and you can see that here. Right, so there's our sub and then our stereo, and this is set to all safe. So you can set an absolute value of the show. So you would leave this at whatever volume. Like, the system's really loud today, let's pull it way down. You know, it's a tiny stadium, or we got to fill up this dome, right? Bring everything up. I would not recommend doing a +10, by the way, but for example only. So you can do absolute volume of the show, absolute volumes of sections, and then relative volumes of sections during the scenes. And again, the way you set that up is your scene safe can be fader off for individual channels and for output, and then for DCA, everything is safe. You could also do this with all for your keyboards, and that would just be an absolute value of each of the instruments that day. I don't like to do that as much because that removes the ability to do like that glockenspiel balance I mentioned earlier, and high to low balance of the mics. So if you did that, you could make a second group that is marimba highs and marimba lows. There's a lot of right and wrong answers to that one. So the soloist group I'll talk about, I did the same idea, and I'm doing this a lot more now recently. But essentially what's happening here is I have the soloist group, and these euphoniums are apparently not in this scene. So this is not the right scene. Let's see if I can find here. There we go. Okay, so you can see these euphoniums are not sending to the stereo, right? But this group is sending to the stereo. So same idea, exact same process. This just helps to blend the mics together. But another thing that I'm doing here is I'm actually using some multiband compression. And so essentially, and I'm going to point this out before I get too deep into this. I do not think this is a good multiband compressor. I don't really think that any of the effects on a TF sound good. And I don't mean that to trash talk any console or manufacturer or anything. I just, I think we've all figured out by now that there's better sounding consoles out there, specifically with the effects. So what I'm doing is a way to get a little bit more out of a system, not get just a slightly better approach. I'm not thinking that this is going to change the world, but this is helpful. So what you can do is you have a specialty reverb or a specialty delay. You can come in here and you can add effects, if you like, of Yamaha's vast selection. That's a joke. Or you can add, a lot of other things. Like you can use them kind of in a tip and trick way. And I'll show you what I'm doing. The multiband on the euphonium group is fine. It's to taste. It's really light, honestly. Excuse me. But the thing that I'm emulating is actually easily noticed over here. And to start, I'll show it on SQ so you can see. So on SQ, I'm doing a little bit of a thing that we like to do a lot of the time to get cymbal noise out. So this gets talked a lot about. I see a lot of people just EQ their cymbals, and if you want to, let me go here. If you want to, you could always come into the group and try and do it via low pass filters. So I know a lot of people will come in and they'll do like a low pass above a certain amount just to get frame noise and cymbal noise out. I don't like to do that if I can avoid it. I know that there's not a lot up there, but it just removes some of the natural sound of a keyboard to me. So I try not to do that. What I do instead is I will go into the compressor, and on a board that has the capability, I'll actually just use the compressor on the group, turn it on. I'll turn the high pass filter on for everything above 5K. And so that essentially means that this is only going to compress signals a little bit that get above 5K, which is mostly cymbal at this venture on a marimba and a vibraphone, right? Vibes are off right now, but the cymbals are on, or the marimbas are on. So you have independent control over that. A TF on the group side, does not have a key, right? So you can see here, I've got a threshold, I've got a ratio, I've got an attack, release, output gain, blah, blah, blah. This does have a compressor on it, and this is just to tame some of the high sounds, some of the loud sounds. That's important. But this compressor doesn't actually key or filter for any of the high frequency input. So I'm doing that in two places. This is a multiband compressor. And what I've done is I'm using some low. There's a couple ways to do this, but what I've done is essentially I'm using the highest threshold to cut out so much of the high level, high volume sounds. But that crossover is at 4.25. For this school, the cymbals are a little bit darker. I went a little bit lower. It still sounds fine. It's just a little more than I would normally do. But somewhere between 5 and 6 is where I normally find myself. And what this is doing, for anybody who's never used a multiband compressor, is it's essentially like 3 compressors in one. So you have a low, mid, and a high. And they're independent of each other, and they have all the compressor things that you would find, output gain. They have knee, right? This one has a knee just for everything, but they also have for individual bands, low ratio, attack, release, mid, high, okay? So what I'm essentially doing is, and these crossover points tell you where those happen. So the low to mid means 180, or is 180, and the high mid is 500. So what that means essentially is that the low band is everything below 180, the high band is everything above 5K, and the middle band is everything in between. So we're rarely hitting this low threshold. This is really just to help with some of the low noise buildup. But the high threshold we're hitting a lot because it's so low, okay? And what I've done is I'm using, this is a particularly egregious example, so this is why I pulled this one up. But this school has a lot of thick, low, ringy cymbals. So what I'm doing is minus 32, 10 to 1, super high attack, mid-ish amount of release, and then this is compressing everything above 5K or 4.25K. So essentially what I'm doing, because we're not really ever hitting these other two thresholds except for in extreme areas, is I've created a compressor that only compresses above 5K. Same as the SQ. You can also do this by bypassing the individual channels. And so what this does is now the high one is the only one that's on, essentially. And so it's only going to affect signals over 5K. But there are options. I leave them bypass or unbypassed and up to the thresholds where they won't hit, just to make it a little bit easier. But that's what doing some of the groups provide you. And so essentially what I've done here is I've created on a console that doesn't have grouping and doesn't have keyed compressors, I've created grouping with keyed compressors. And so now the full philosophy is that this group is the place for you to do relative volume changes inside of your show, right, using your scenes. And then this DCA is for the big macro changes. Now, the thing I haven't explained yet, oh, and it also does your processing. The thing I haven't explained yet is how you're setting this up. So I mentioned that I've unstereoed them, but because it's not a group, what you have to do is you do your sends to faders the same way you do in an SQ. And you have to send everything at 0 and make sure it's on instead of just making sure it's on. So for this wood group, I'm sending my marimbas. For the metal group, I'm sending my metals here. My marimbas are off. And then for the euphonium group, I'm sending those euphoniums, right? And then these are actually unused channels from a template of mine, but you're sending those euphoniums, which can be found here. Right? So euphonium group, 3 euphoniums, done. So that means now you have metal group, wood group for your solos. You can make as much of those solos as you want. You can also, you only really need one. You could just have a solo group because you can have each of those things be affected on a scene-by-scene basis. So in reality, I could have the name of this change and the processing change and the effects change and everything group to group. And that just means that this euphonium group could be my solo group, and you only need one. So you could have in TF land one for woods, one for metals, one's for drum set, one for solos, one spare one for something else, and then a subgroup. And so the reason that we're getting to this last is because hopefully this all makes sense at this point. But I mentioned that there's 2 subs in this file. So there's a mono sub, and this is the one that's built in, and then there's a sub, and this is the one that I made. And the reason we do this is because every 1 0.001% of shows I do, there's going to be something that is sub-frequency that needs panning. And subs are an omnidirectional signal. And for all intents and purposes, we don't have to get into the math of that. So I know that there's going to be some disagreement among this one, but every now and again, if you got sousaphone playing super low stuff on the side right 30, I want to try my best to steer that a little bit to the right. Side 2, sorry, not side right. I want to try my best to steer that to the right just a little bit. Or if you've got a synth thing that's like maybe an extreme hard panning from left to right, and it really needs to feel like the sub-frequency moves with it, and the speakers are far enough apart for that to matter, that's an important factor as well, I'll make a sub-fader. So that's why that exists, but it's essentially the exact same idea. You make a group, you make sure the recall settings are the same, and this is the same recall settings as my, excuse me, I was already there, as my main, so just nothing changes on it. You set this level at the beginning of the show, and then you only send synth to it. And that's basically all of your electronic elements that need sub-frequencies. And that's that. So hopefully that helps. Essentially, the long and short of this whole long discussion is having groups and DCAs do separate functions is really good. It's going to take a little bit of time to understand how those and busing and all of the terminology works. But once you wrap your head around it, you can kind of see that there's a level and a layer for during show mixes that will affect all the scenes. And then there's a layer for during rehearsal, getting the scenes right, that will affect individual scenes and be a way for you to get much more micro in the mix. Having these auxes have EQs and compressions of their own and effects gives you a lot more control. On a TF, by the way, all of the panning that you can see here, that does get routed via the aux, so you don't have to do any extra steps. If you're on an SQ, that's a little bit different, but this is a video about a TF. But it's pretty simple to set up. All you do is just send your channels to the aux you want to send to. Make sure that they're unassigned from the stereo, because if you don't do that, like that, there it was. I knew I set up one of them to show you. You want to make sure that that's unassigned to the stereo, because if you leave that one on, you just check, okay, they're all unassigned from the stereo, and you leave one channel on, you're going to have one ringing marimba through the main that it's going to drive you crazy. So assign them to your bus. Make sure they're off on the main layer, which is, by the way, is not this on button. It's very important. It's this ST button. Make sure they're off on the main layer, and then you're going to just use your group to send to the stereo, which you'll make sure you assigned, hopefully. Okay. That way, you have all these beautiful functionalities, and then you can do that for the solos as well, and you can basically use all these tips and tricks for everything. You could add a third effect to your solos if you really wanted to. You come in here and add, like a fun chorus or something to your soloist. There's lots of options. So I hope that helps. I'd love to answer more questions. And if you like this kind of content where I'm just kind of going through a little bit of my philosophy, let me know. I'm thinking about doing a few more of these videos, and I would love to go through how I set up my board files, maybe talk a little about the kind of philosophy for balance and gain staging, and anything that I can help to get stuff right on the first try, because I know that that's a lot of what we struggle with, and a lot of what I run into is setups that are not as efficient that we make in July, and then we get to October and need to do some rearranging. So happy to talk through a little bit more of my funtivities along the way, and I'll see you all very soon. Thanks.